The wind that swept across the barren edge of the Belarusian lowlands carried with it the faint scent of soil recently disturbed, an odor that seemed to seep through the cracks of time itself. It drifted over the quiet village of Starie Kleni, a place where memory and silence had learned to coexist through the decades, where barns leaned under the weight of their own age, and where the ghosts of 1943 still clung to the earth as stubbornly as the last autumn frost. In the winter of 2023, the village stirred again, not because of war or famine or the restless armies that once pressed across its fields, but because a pair of curious hands had dug too deep beneath the old wooden barn at the edge of the settlement. Those hands belonged to Pavel Dranov, a farmer who had decided, after 30 years of postponement, that the sagging structure behind his house finally needed a new foundation. He had expected to find rot, stones, perhaps some abandoned farming tools from his grandfather's time. What he unearthed instead stopped him cold and forced the breath from his lungs. The bones were thin, brittle, and unmistakably human. They lay curled inward as if the last moments of whoever they belonged to had been swallowed by cold and fear. But it was not the bones that made Pavel stumble backward. It was the small rusted insignia resting against the rib cage, an insignia that time should have devoured. A Soviet star, barely recognizable yet enduring, fused to a corroded fragment of a rank badge. News spread through the village with the unsettling speed of something long buried, finally demanding to be heard. The elderly whispered about the war years, about prisoners marched through the forests, about partisans who disappeared without explanation, about the strange rumors that had circulated just before the front shifted west. Younger villagers listened with uneasy fascination, aware that their homes and their land sat atop the remnants of a world soaked in blood and secrecy. By the time local authorities arrived, the crowd around the barn had grown thick, everyone murmuring, everyone guessing. But beneath the chatter, beneath the curious excitement, there was an undercurrent of dread, the sense that some secrets resist daylight. The officers cordoned off the area, lifted the remains with quiet precision, and carried them toward the awaiting vehicle. Even then, even under the muted light of a gray December afternoon, the badge seemed to glimmer with a stubborn will, as if refusing to let its story die for good. Half a century earlier, the land had looked different. The fields were raw and scarred by artillery tracks, the trees thinner from the winter's hunger. In early 1943, Soviet prisoners of war were used like expendable labor across the occupied territories. The Germans organized work details with brutal efficiency and punished any sign of weakness with immediate violence. One of the camps near the outskirts of the very village where the barn now stood held men from all corners of the Soviet Union. They built defensive fortifications by day and slept in makeshift huts by night. Among them was Lieutenant Mikhail Ardentsev, a communications officer who had been captured during the chaotic retreat from Vyazma. He was tall, quiet, and sharp-eyed, a man whose loyalty to his comrades was matched only by his determination to escape. For months he watched the guards, noted their routines, and memorized the pattern of their patrols. When the moment came, he did not hesitate. Under a moonless sky, he slipped through a gap in the fence with 2 other prisoners, both weakened yet hopeful, and vanished into the dense forests that stretched northward. Only one set of those 3 footsteps would carry forward into legend, and even that legend would eventually fade into a whisper. At this point in the tale, tell me, where are you watching this from? The escape did not go smoothly. Snowdrifts swallowed the path, and the hunger that gnawed their stomachs felt almost alive. One of the men collapsed on the second night and begged the others to leave him. They did not want to, but the approaching dogs forced their hand. The other companion lasted 3 more days, limping through the frost-bitten woods until he could no longer stand. Mikhail left him wrapped in branches beneath a pine tree, promising to return, though he knew he would never have that chance. Alone and weakened, he moved west, guided only by the faint hope of reaching partisan units rumored to be hiding in the marshes. Yet the land itself seemed to conspire against him. Frozen rivers cracked underfoot, clouds dimmed the sun, and every distant shout carried the threat of recapture. Still he continued, driven by something deeper than survival, something like defiance, something like duty. Local memory of those days blurred with time, but fragments persisted. Old notebooks, fading letters, and stories passed through generations hinted at a lone Soviet officer who had once stumbled into Starye Kleny shortly after the new year of 1943. He was gaunt, delirious and half-frozen, whispering about comrades lost in the snow. A family living near the forest's edge had taken him in for one night, risking execution if the Germans discovered him. Their daughter, only 12 then, wrote decades later that the officer's eyes held a fire that refused to die even in the coldest winter. She recalled how he insisted on leaving before dawn, convinced that staying would doom the family. She never saw him again. When the front retreated months later, soldiers found traces of skirmishes in the woods and rumors of a lone escapee who had slipped repeatedly through German search lines. But the officer himself had vanished completely, swallowed by silence. Now, 80 years later, that silence had cracked open beneath a barn. The forensic team that examined the remains concluded that the man had died violently. Rib fractures indicated blunt force trauma, likely delivered with a rifle butt or heavy tool. There were also deep indentations on the skull that suggested multiple blows. Yet there were no bullet wounds. This meant the death had been personal, deliberate, not a matter of following military procedure, but of someone wanting the victim to suffer. The rank badge, miraculously preserved enough to identify, revealed that the remains most likely belonged to a Soviet lieutenant. Records from the region between January and March of 1943 listed only one escaped lieutenant believed to have passed through the area, Mikhail Ardentsev. But if that were true, then the circumstances of his end were far darker than anyone had imagined. The barn itself, once owned by a reclusive farmer who died in the late 50s, suddenly became the focal point of painful speculation. The farmer's neighbors had always considered him strange. Some whispered that during the occupation he collaborated with whoever held power at the time. Others insisted he had sheltered fugitives in secret. Yet his barn stood quietly through the decades, its foundation undisturbed until Pavel's renovation. If Mikhail's bones had rested beneath it all this time, then someone had taken great care to conceal them. Someone had buried him not in haste, but with intention, tamping the soil firmly enough that generations walked over it unaware. As the investigation deepened, documents resurfaced that had not been read in years. German patrol logs referenced an unnamed informant in Starye Kleny who had provided details about suspected partisan movements. Meanwhile, partisan journals recorded an account of a Soviet officer who never reached their base despite being expected. These two fragments, though never previously connected, now seemed to point toward a single, grim possibility. An informant could have lured the officer with false promises of safety, then killed him before he reached the partisans, burying him beneath the barn for reasons that only the dead could fully explain. But no names were listed, no guilt assigned. The fog of war protected both cowardice and desperation, and history had long since sealed its lips around the truth. A sense of foreboding settled over the villagers as these old possibilities came to light. They walked past the barn with a different kind of awareness, as though the ground itself had become a chronicle of suffering. Pavel, who had never expected that repairing his property would plunge him into the center of a mystery older than his parents, spent many nights unable to sleep. He wondered if the spirit of the fallen officer lingered, not in the superstitious sense, but in the unresolved weight of his story. In the long quiet of winter evenings, he imagined the lieutenant crawling through snow, clutching his side, peering through trees for any sign of hope, only to find betrayal instead. The thought gnawed at him. The regional archive confirmed that the badge belonged to the correct period and matched those issued to communications officers. It also matched descriptions from the diary of the young girl who remembered sheltering Mikhail for a single night. Her words, delicate and trembling, seemed almost prophetic now. She described him as a man carrying an invisible storm. The storm had finally found its voice beneath the barn. For investigators, the next steps involved DNA analysis, interviews with the last surviving descendants of those who lived in the village during the war, and a deeper exploration of partisan records. For the ordinary residents of Starye Kleni, the next steps were less scientific and more existential. How do you live atop a past that refuses to stay hidden? How do you reconcile a peaceful village with the violence buried at its edge? The truth, or its closest approximation, seemed both near and impossibly distant. The discovery had stirred old fears, old guilt, old stories preserved only in half-forgotten memories. A presence settled over the land, not haunting in the supernatural sense, but heavy in the way unresolved history presses against the present. Even children sensed it. They refused to play near the barn, insisting that the wind there felt colder. Adults dismissed this as imagination, but avoided the area themselves as evening approached. The villagers gathered one night in Pavel's kitchen, sharing theories and confessions passed down through their families. One elderly man claimed his father once mentioned seeing German officers talking to a local late at night near that same barn. Another woman remembered hearing that a wounded Soviet soldier had crawled into the village and sought help. But these were stories layered with decades of distortion, shaped by fear and silence. No one could say for certain whether Mikhail had been betrayed, whether the killer acted out of loyalty to the Germans, or whether panic and self-preservation drove the act. Perhaps only one person had ever known the truth, and that person had taken it to the grave, leaving behind a secret that waited until 2023 to claw its way back into the world. As the first topic of this dark investigation settles into place, consider supporting this journey into forgotten shadows. If the story has drawn you into its cold breath and lingering mystery, subscribe to the channel so you do not miss what emerges next from the depths of this buried past. The second topic begins in the chilled corridors of the Grodno Regional Archives, where dust seemed to breathe with its own rhythm, and where history slept restlessly in boxes marked by years rather than names. It was here that the investigation into the bones found beneath the barn truly deepened, transforming from a local curiosity into something far heavier, far more intimate. Archivist Natalia Resnick, a quiet woman in her late 50s with the patience of someone accustomed to listening to ghosts, was the first to uncover a document that had long escaped attention. It was a German field report dated February 18, 1943, describing the capture of an unidentified Red Army escapee near the Berezina marshes, wounded, delirious, but carrying a small coded notebook. The report ended abruptly, its last lines smudged by water damage. There was no mention of where the prisoner had been taken afterward. When Natalia compared this report with the Soviet Missing in Action registry from the same period, a single name echoed like a faint bell through the paper maze. Lieutenant Mikhail Ardentsev, 3rd Signal Corps, last seen east of the Berezina, presumed dead. His service record ended there, but the story that followed would stretch across decades. Natalia printed the pages, spreading them across her desk, under the pale glow of a desk lamp. The photograph attached to Mikhail's file was faint, but his eyes still carried the intensity that others had described, focused, unwavering, aware of some unspoken truth. She stared at that photograph for a long time, sensing that this man had refused to vanish quietly, that even in death his story demanded to be understood. Meanwhile, forensic specialists in Minsk continued their examination of the remains. Every fragment told a story: soil residue under the rib cage, splinters of decayed wood that hinted at a coffin hastily built, or perhaps a shallow grave beneath a structure that would later be expanded. A rusted button from a Soviet uniform still clung to a strip of fabric, its color long gone, but its weave pattern identifiable as Red Army issue. Microscopic analysis revealed traces of ash mixed with the soil, likely from burnt documents or weapons, suggesting an attempt to erase evidence. Yet the most haunting detail lay not in what was found, but in what wasn't. No personal belongings, no weapon, no tags. Whoever buried Mikhail had stripped him of identity, leaving only the rank badge as a cruel remnant of who he had once been. As winter settled heavier across Belarus, journalists began to circle the story. They called it the Barn Soldier. For some, it was a simple historical curiosity. For others, a reminder that the war's wounds were not yet closed. But for Pavel, the farmer who had unearthed the bones, it had become something almost spiritual. His nights grew longer, his dreams plagued by the image of the star-shaped badge glinting in the dirt. He felt a weight, as if he had not simply disturbed a grave, but awakened a presence. In those dreams, he often found himself standing in the snow, watching a man in a tattered Soviet coat walking ahead, leaving footprints that vanished as soon as they formed. Each time he tried to call out, the figure turned, and Pavel would wake, breathless, heart pounding, unable to shake the feeling that he was being watched not by something malicious, but by something desperate. In late January 2024, the DNA results arrived. They confirmed what Natalia had suspected. The remains matched the surviving relatives of a branch of the Ardentsev family still living near Kursk. The match was 98.4% conclusive. The bones beneath the barn belonged to Lieutenant Mikhail Ardentsev, but the answer only deepened the questions. How had he traveled hundreds of kilometers beyond the area of his escape? Who had betrayed him or sheltered him before his death? And why had he been buried in such a deliberate, concealed manner? The surviving Ardentsev relatives were few. One of them, an aging man named Victor, agreed to speak publicly for the first time. His voice trembled as he described the family legend, that Mikhail had escaped captivity, joined a partisan group, and died a hero somewhere in the forests. It was a tale of bravery and sacrifice, one that generations had used as a quiet source of pride. To learn that Mikhail had instead been murdered and hidden beneath a barn struck Victor like a physical blow. "He didn't die in battle," he said softly to the interviewer. "He was silenced. That's different. That means someone feared what he knew. His words triggered a wave of speculation. Historians began to examine partisan records more closely. One entry in particular stood out. A coded message sent by radio in February 1943, mentioning a messenger from the Vyazma front, carrying information vital to Soviet command. The message ended abruptly after reporting that the messenger never arrived. Could Mikhail have been that messenger? If so, his death beneath a peasant's barn was not a coincidence but a calculated act of sabotage. Natalia traveled to Starye Kleny herself. She wanted to see the place, to stand where the story had ended or begun. The village greeted her with the wary politeness reserved for outsiders who come asking about things better left buried. The barn stood just beyond the edge of the settlement, its roof patched with tin, its walls bowed inward. A thin crust of frost coated the soil where the excavation had taken place. She knelt there for a moment, brushing her gloved hand over the earth, feeling the faint unevenness of the disturbed ground. It was strange, she thought, how history could hide so quietly beneath the most ordinary places. She met Pavel that evening. His eyes carried the exhaustion of someone who had seen too much and slept too little. He showed her the spot, the small wooden cross he had placed over it, and the area where the badge had been found. "It doesn't feel like it's over," he admitted, his voice low. "Sometimes I hear footsteps at night, like someone walking near the barn, but when I look, there's no one." Natalia didn't dismiss him. She understood that history's echoes often sounded like ghosts, especially when truth was only half told. The following week, another document emerged, a Soviet counterintelligence file declassified only months earlier. It referenced a Lieutenant A, suspected of having witnessed the betrayal of partisan units by local collaborators before his capture. If Mikhail had indeed known names, movements, or details that could expose traitors, his death made sense not as random violence but as an intentional silencing. What had begun as an escape from German captivity might have ended as an execution carried out by those he thought were allies. The atmosphere in Starye Kleny grew tense as these possibilities surfaced. The descendants of wartime villagers felt uneasy, as if ancestral guilt hovered in the frosty air. Rumors spread that some families had benefited suspiciously well during the occupation, acquiring land and livestock left behind by deported neighbors. Now, with Mikhail's story returning from the grave, old suspicions found new life. Arguments broke out in the small community hall, accusations veiled as questions. History, it seemed, was no longer confined to the past. It was crawling back into the present, demanding attention. One night, Pavel returned to the barn alone. The wind howled through the cracks in the wood, carrying with it the faint scent of burnt earth. He lit a lantern and placed it on the ground where the bones had lain. For a long time, he stood silently, the light flickering across his face. Then he spoke, not to anyone living, but to the man whose death had upended his quiet life. "I don't know what they did to you," he whispered, "but I'll make sure they don't forget." The lantern's flame trembled as if in response. By spring, Natalia compiled her findings into a detailed report for the Belarusian Historical Commission. It combined forensic evidence, archival discoveries, and testimonies from surviving witnesses. Her conclusion was cautious but haunting. Lieutenant Ardentsev's death was consistent with targeted execution following betrayal during partisan contact. She added one final note at the bottom, a personal reflection. "The soil remembers what people choose to forget." The report was never officially published. Bureaucratic hesitation, political discomfort, perhaps fear of reopening wounds. Whatever the reason, it was quietly shelved. But copies leaked. Online communities picked it up, blending fact with speculation, theory with legend. Some claimed the barn stood over a mass grave of other partisans. Others believed the killer had been a villager still revered as a war hero. The story grew darker, more entangled, feeding on uncertainty. As for Pavel, he continued tending his land. But he never rebuilt the barn. Instead, he let the space remain open, the soil bare, as if acknowledging the man beneath it. Visitors occasionally came to see the site, leaving small red stars or flowers, treating it as a place of quiet mourning. Each time, the air seemed to hum faintly, a reminder that the past is never truly gone. It only waits for the living to listen. If this shadowed tale draws you closer, let its silence pull you deeper. There are more secrets buried beneath this cold ground. Stay with us. Subscribe to uncover what lies beneath the next layer of this haunting mystery. The summer that followed brought warmth to the fields of Starie Kleni, but it could not thaw the chill that had settled over the village. The soil was rich and dark, heavy with both history and unease. Every time the wind shifted across the meadows, it seemed to carry whispers from beneath the earth, murmurs that refused to fade. The barn had been reduced to a flattened space of bare ground, a scar in the center of a landscape trying to heal. But the scar still bled memory, and the villagers still avoided it at night. Pavel Dranov's life had changed irreversibly since the day he uncovered those bones. He had become something between a caretaker and a witness, the unwilling guardian of a story that belonged to a dead man. At first, journalists hounded him, cameras flashing, questions echoing. But as months passed and the world's attention drifted elsewhere, silence returned. Silence and something else. Some nights he swore he heard faint signals, static, the soft crackle of a radio transmission coming from his old barn foundation. When he followed the sound, it would fade, leaving only the rustle of wind through dry grass. In Minsk, Natalia Reznik continued her obsessive search for truth. Her office became a labyrinth of documents, maps, and fragments of testimony. Among the most revealing discoveries was a series of coded partisan transmissions intercepted by the Germans in 1943. She noticed one that used a cipher identical to Mikhail Ardentsev's communications signature. It mentioned coordinates not far from Starie Kleni. Another clue, another echo in the dark. The message read, "Package secured, awaiting pickup before dawn." The pickup never came. That short, cryptic line would haunt Natalia for weeks. By comparing German patrol routes and partisan signal logs, Natalia pieced together a plausible route of Mikhail's escape. He had likely crossed the Berezina on foot, avoiding patrols, surviving on melted snow and bark, before reaching the region near the village. Somewhere along the way, he must have made contact with local resistance members, but who they were, and who among them might have betrayed him, remained the key to everything. The archives mentioned a small cell known as the Iron Grove Unit, active in the area from late 1942 to early 1943. They specialized in courier routes, sabotage, and safe houses. Their leader, codename Boris, vanished in the spring of 1943. Around the same time, Mikhail disappeared. Natalia tracked down Boris's real name, Anton Gurin. He had survived the war and later emigrated to Poland, dying there in 1961. His personal effects had been auctioned off, but one item, a locked metal box, was still held by his granddaughter in Krakow. After weeks of correspondence, Natalia convinced her to let her examine it. Inside the box, she found faded photographs, medals, and a small leather-bound notebook sealed with a string. Most pages were blank, except for one, where a single line had been written in trembling Cyrillic script. "The messenger came, but truth is heavier than bullets." The handwriting matched Anton's wartime letters. That phrase, "truth heavier than bullets," resonated like a confession. Natalia could almost see it. A weary partisan commander faced with a young lieutenant carrying information that could doom collaborators or expose divided loyalties. The Germans were closing in. The local population was terrified, and somewhere in that chaos, someone decided that silence was safer than truth. Pavel learned about Natalia's discoveries through a late-night phone call. Her voice carried both excitement and exhaustion. She told him about Anton Gurin, about the notebook, about the phrase. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Pavel said, "So he wasn't just a lost soldier. He was silenced because he knew something." Natalia's silence was her answer. That night the wind rose again over the plains. Pavel dreamed of the lieutenant, not as a ghost, but as a man trudging through snow, bleeding from his side, clutching a notebook to his chest. The sound of distant artillery rumbled like thunder, and the figure turned toward him, his face calm despite the chaos. "It wasn't the enemy," he whispered in the dream. "It was those who feared what I carried." Pavel woke before dawn, heart hammering, his breath white in the morning cold. Weeks later, a local historian named Artyom joined the investigation. He was young, ambitious, and unafraid to ask questions that older academics avoided. Together with Natalia, he traced records of food requisitions and civilian lists from early 1943. One stood out, a requisition signed by German occupation authorities and co-signed by a civilian intermediary named O. Gurin, Anton's brother. That name connected two families, two roles, one fighting for freedom, the other serving survival. If Mikhail had stumbled into the wrong hands, he might have been handed over not to the Germans directly, but to those pretending to resist while quietly cooperating. The betrayal could have been both personal and pragmatic, a trade of one life for safety. Rumors began to circulate online that a hidden cache of documents remained buried near the barn site, perhaps hidden by Mikhail himself before capture. Amateur diggers arrived, armed with metal detectors and cameras, hoping to uncover the lost notebook of the lieutenant. Most found nothing but old nails and fragments of farm tools, but one group claimed to have found something small and metallic near the barn's foundation, a corroded tin fragment with faint engraved letters, barely legible, but deciphered as Ardent, the beginning of his surname. Whether genuine or staged, the discovery reignited interest in the story, turning the barn into a sight of uneasy pilgrimage. The government grew cautious. Officials discouraged further excavation, citing safety and respect for historical remains. But people kept coming, leaving coins, notes, small Soviet badges, even photographs of relatives lost in the war. The site became not just about Mikhail Ardentsev, but about everyone who vanished without a grave, everyone whose story was erased. In the evenings, Pavel would watch the offerings accumulate, and though he didn't believe in spirits, he sometimes felt that the land itself was listening. Natalia, meanwhile, began experiencing something she couldn't quite explain. Late in her office, she would sometimes hear the faint rhythmic click of Morse code, though no device was running. She convinced herself it was imagination, the residue of too many late nights among old radios and files. But one night she wrote down the sequence of clicks, translating it instinctively. The message spelled a single word: stay. She laughed it off, nervous, dismissive. Yet deep down, she wondered. Could the frequencies, the overlapping memories of war, somehow still resonate in the walls, in the frequencies of the old buildings, in her own mind? Or had the lieutenant found a new way to reach the living? By autumn, the threads of the story had become almost mythic. Scholars debated whether Mikhail's escape and death reflected a broader network of internal Soviet betrayals. Some saw him as a victim of German reprisals, others as collateral in partisan rivalries. But Natalia's conclusion was simpler, more human. Mikhail Ardentsev was a man who carried knowledge too dangerous for any side. He survived captivity only to die among supposed allies. His body was buried beneath the structure of survival itself, literally hidden under a barn built to endure winters. His story pressed into the earth until time decided it was ready to be heard again. One evening, Natalia returned once more to Starye Kleny. Dusk stretched across the fields like an old photograph. Pavel met her near the site, where wild grass now grew tall. Together, they stood in silence. "Do you think he forgives us?" Pavel asked quietly. Natalia took a long breath before answering. "Forgiveness belongs to the living. The dead only ask to be remembered." Before they left, Pavel placed a small radio on the ground, an old Soviet model he had repaired himself. He tuned it to static and left it there, humming faintly beneath the wind. The next morning, when he returned, the radio had stopped, but its dial had shifted slightly, as if touched by unseen hands, as this chapter of silence begins to close. Remember, some truths rest beneath our feet, waiting for the right moment to rise. If this story has found you in its shadows, let it follow you further. Subscribe to keep walking beside the forgotten, where history still breathes beneath the dust. The winter of 2024 returned to Starye Kleny like a familiar wound reopening. Snow swallowed the landscape, smoothing every scar, concealing the land's unease beneath a deceptive purity. But those who lived there knew the ground was restless. Beneath the white hush, beneath the frozen fields, lay stories that refused to be silenced. The barn site had become a place of strange reverence, a memorial without inscription. People came quietly, left offerings, took photographs, and left as though retreating from something sacred and fragile. By now, everyone in the region knew the name Lieutenant Mikhail Ardentsev, yet the truth surrounding his death still twisted like smoke, just beyond reach. In the dark interior of her Minsk apartment, Natalia Resnik spent her nights cross-referencing military correspondences and old maps spread across the floor, like an unsolved crime scene. She no longer worked officially for the archive. Her obsession had consumed her position. But obsession was the only thing that kept the silence at bay. She replayed interviews, reread field notes, revisited every detail of the remains. Again and again she returned to that phrase found in Anton Gurin's notebook. The messenger came, but truth is heavier than bullets. It gnawed at her, demanded interpretation. Was Anton confessing his guilt, or warning that truth itself could destroy those who uncovered it? She began visiting the families of those who had lived in Starye Kleny during the war, searching for descendants who might know what their grandparents never said aloud. Many doors closed in her face, but one opened. A frail woman in her 80s named Irina, who lived in a small house near the river. Her grandmother, she said, had once worked as a nurse during the occupation, tending to both villagers and wounded soldiers who hid in the woods. Irina's hands trembled as she poured tea. "My grandmother used to whisper about a man who came here once," she said. "A Red Army officer. She said his eyes were not like other men's. He knew something, and it frightened even those who wanted to help him." Irina retrieved a small box from a cupboard. Inside lay a scrap of yellowed paper folded tightly upon itself. She handed it to Natalia with quiet reverence. The writing was barely legible. The ink faded to the color of dried leaves, but the words were clear enough. "Do not trust those who speak of shelter. They watch both sides." It was unsigned, but the handwriting, precise, military, matched samples from Mikhail's letters preserved in the archives. Natalia's pulse quickened. If the note was authentic, it meant Mikhail had known betrayal was closing in. As she left Irina's house, dusk pressed against the horizon like a bruise. The trees loomed bare and skeletal, their shadows long and spindly across the snow. Natalia's breath fogged in the cold air as she walked, her thoughts swirling with the implications. Someone in Staria Kleni had pretended to help him. Someone had handed him over, or worse, and that someone had lived long enough to see peace declared, to rebuild, to raise children under the same roof where a man had died, begging for trust. Back in Minsk, Natalia reached out to Aryom, her young historian colleague. Together they examined German intelligence records stored in a digital archive recently released from Berlin. Among the files was a fragmentary interrogation transcript of a local informant, dated February 1943. The informant's name was redacted, but several clues remained. Male, early 30s, resident of village near Berezina supply route. His statements mentioned a Soviet escapee who spoke of partisan betrayal. Natalia read the lines aloud in the dim glow of her monitor. "He told them something he shouldn't have," she murmured. Artyom leaned closer. "Or maybe," he said, "someone told the Germans about him first." If this was true, it painted a grim picture. Mikhail might have carried intelligence not only about German positions, but about compromised partisans, traitors operating under Soviet guise. If he reached Staria Kleni and shared what he knew with the wrong people, his death might have been a desperate act of damage control. It wasn't just fear. It was survival, of families, of reputations, of the fragile network that kept collaboration hidden after the war. Outside, snow fell harder. In the isolation of her study, Natalia recorded her notes aloud, her voice trembling between exhaustion and revelation. "Lieutenant Ardentsev," she said quietly into the recorder, "you weren't simply a victim of war. You were the price of silence. They buried you so deeply the earth itself tried to forget. But the earth remembers." Meanwhile, in the village, Pavel's nights grew increasingly haunted. The once peaceful man had begun hearing whispers in the wind again. Fragments of sentences, indistinct but human. His animals refused to enter the barn's remains, circling nervously whenever he approached. One evening, while stacking firewood, he noticed something glinting faintly in the soil near the barn's edge. He knelt and brushed the snow aside. It was a small metal clasp, no larger than a thumb. On its underside were engraved Cyrillic letters, almost worn away by time. "Dla Chota," for report. It was a military tool tag used to mark items in a courier's field kit. Pavel felt a cold sweat break over him. The lieutenant had been carrying reports, perhaps still had them when he was killed. When he told Natalia, she asked him to keep it safe. She feared that anything tied to Mikhail's last mission could attract unwanted attention. Not all who lived in the region appreciated the story resurfacing. Some families whispered that Natalia was disturbing the dead. Others, that she was prying into secrets better left untouched. A few anonymous letters even arrived at her door. No threats, just a single repeated phrase written in block script. Let him sleep. But she couldn't stop. The truth had taken root in her mind like frost spreading across glass. She returned once more to the archives, where she found a seemingly unrelated set of documents. A 1946 investigation file into partisan collaboration and falsification of heroism. The accused included several names from the Iron Grove unit, one of them, O. Gurin. The charges were dropped. The witnesses disappeared. Natalia felt the walls of time close around her. If the Gurins had silenced Mikhail to protect their dual allegiance, then rewritten history had allowed them to die as heroes. The state, eager to rebuild unity, had buried evidence alongside his bones. Artyom urged caution. You're walking on thin ground, he warned. These aren't just archives anymore. You're crossing into memory, and memory fights back. But Natalia pressed on. She drafted a manuscript, though part investigation, part confession, detailing every thread of her research. She titled it, The Messenger Who Never Arrived. She intended to release it anonymously, not as an accusation, but as an act of remembrance. That night, as she finished typing the final page, the lights in her apartment flickered. Outside, a storm gathered, snow driven by fierce wind, the city reduced to shifting shadows. Natalia stared at her reflection in the dark window. For a moment, she thought she saw movement behind her, just a flicker, a shape in the corner of her eye. She turned, heart racing, but the room was empty. Then she noticed the faint smell of soil, damp and cold, as though someone had just come in from the frozen ground. She sat back down, trembling but resolute. Truth is heavier than bullets, she whispered, then let it weigh on me. Days later, she traveled again to Starye Kleni to deliver the clasp to local historians for preservation. When she arrived, the air was unnaturally still. Frost shimmered across the ground like glass. The barn site seemed different, quieter, as if holding its breath. She placed the clasp beside the small cross marking the lieutenant's grave. You carried this once, she murmured, and it carried you back to us. For a moment she thought she heard faint footsteps in the snow behind her. She turned quickly, but there was nothing, only the soft whisper of the wind passing through the trees. Her return journey was long, silent. The radio in her car crackled faintly, though no station played. For a few seconds, she heard a burst of static, followed by rhythmic taps. She froze, realizing it was Morse again. She reached for her notebook, translating instinctively. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short, SOS. But then after a pause, 3 more letters followed. End. After that night, Natalia vanished from public view. Emails unanswered, phone disconnected, her manuscript unpublished. Artyom searched for her, visiting her apartment only to find it empty. The lights still worked, the papers still neatly arranged. Only her recorder was missing. Weeks passed before he received a small envelope in the mail, postmarked from an unknown sender. Inside was a flash drive containing her final audio log. In it, Natalia's voice was calm, almost serene. I think he's found peace, she said. The ground doesn't whisper anymore. A faint sound followed, like distant footsteps in snow, before the recording cut to static. The file ended there. Artyom decided not to publish the recording. He archived it quietly under her name, noting only, Last known message, January 17th, 2025. In Starie Kleni, the villagers say the storms that winter were unlike any they had seen in decades. The wind howled across the open fields, and in its voice, some claimed they could hear a rhythm: 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. SOS. Others said it was only imagination. Yet whenever the wind quieted, the silence seemed to carry weight, as if the land itself were breathing more easily now that one of its stories had been told. So much of history is written by those who survive. But the dead, patient and persistent, find ways to speak through the cracks of our forgetfulness. Beneath the snow, beneath the rotting roots and frost-bitten soil, lies not just the body of Lieutenant Mikhail Ardentsev, but the echo of every secret that ever begged to be unearthed. If the story has followed you into the dark, let it stay with you a little longer. Like the whisper beneath the wind, remember to keep listening. There are more voices buried here, waiting for light. Subscribe, and don't look away. The next layer is deeper still. By the time spring crept back into the fields of Starie Kleni in 2025, the snow had melted, but the silence remained. The earth was damp and dark, breathing slowly as though exhausted from holding its secrets through another long winter. The barn site had become something of a legend, not an official memorial, not a tourist destination, but a quiet point of pilgrimage for those drawn to the intersection of history and haunting. Travelers from across the country came to stand over the patch of ground where Lieutenant Mikhail Ardentsev had been unearthed. They said that sometimes, if the air was still enough, you could feel the vibration of distant static beneath your feet, like the ghost of a radio signal trapped in the soil. The villagers had grown used to these strangers. They spoke of them in hushed tones, half proud, half fearful, as though their tiny settlement had become the center of something too large to comprehend. The old men at the tavern called it the cursed spot. The women lit candles near their windows when the wind began to howl, whispering prayers that mixed Christian words with older, earth-bound superstitions. The children dared each other to walk to the barn at night, though none ever stayed long enough to prove their courage. The past, once buried and forgotten, now watched the living with quiet, unblinking patience. Artyom was the only one still chasing the truth. After Natalia's disappearance, he had sworn he would finish her work. The flash drive she left him contained not just her final audio recording, but also an encrypted folder of documents. It took him weeks to decode them. Letters, intelligence summaries, witness lists, all fragments of a puzzle that seemed to arrange themselves only in the dark. Among the files was something new, a digitized scan of a 1943 German communication, never before catalogued, referencing the courier intercepted near Kleni village. It confirmed that Mikhail had indeed carried documents when he was captured. But the message contained a strange annotation in the margin, likely written by a German officer, transferred to civilian custody for handling. Civilian custody. Those words chilled Artyom. It meant that Mikhail had not been executed by the Germans, but by locals. This revelation turned everything upside down. It was no longer the story of an officer dying behind enemy lines. It was the story of a man betrayed by his own. Artyom began tracing post-war property transfers in the region. Curious who had acquired land once owned by those implicated in the Iron Grove unit. His search led him back, inevitably, to the same plot of earth where the barn stood. Ownership had changed hands twice. First in 1948, again in 1957. Both transfers bore the signature of one name, Gurin. the family of the same Anton and Oleg who had crossed the line between partisans and collaborators, the same family that had likely killed Mikhail Ardentsev and built a barn over his grave to bury their guilt along with his body. But there was one more twist. The 1957 deed included an attached note. Renovation approved. Foundation reinforced after subsidence. Artyom's pulse quickened as he read. Subsidence. Ground sinking. The earth had shifted. Perhaps that was the moment when the past had stirred, when the bones below began to push upward toward air and light, toward rediscovery. Driven by obsession, Artyom returned to Starye Kleny. He found Pavel working quietly in his fields, his face weathered, his eyes distant. They spoke in low voices as the evening sun sank behind the trees. "It's not over," Artyom said. "I think I know who did it." Pavel didn't react with shock. He simply nodded, as if he had been expecting the words. "The Gurins," he said softly. "My grandfather told me once, never trust that family. They built their house on stolen land and silence." The two men decided to search for any trace of the original barn foundation that hadn't been excavated. Under the cover of dusk, they worked by lantern light, their shovels striking frozen clumps of soil. It was slow, heavy work. Then, just as they were about to stop, the metal edge of Artyom's shovel hit something hollow. He knelt, brushing away the dirt. It was a wooden box, rotted but intact. They carried it to Pavel's kitchen, where the single bulb cast pale circles of light on the table. Inside, beneath a layer of decayed cloth, lay several sheets of paper sealed in wax. The documents were in Russian, the ink faded but legible. They were coded reports, messages meant for Soviet intelligence marked urgent. But one, written in plain language, stole the air from the room. It was a letter addressed to Commandant District 12, Partisan Liaison, dated February 10th, 1943. It read, "I have secured information confirming infiltration of German sympathizers within our own networks. Trust must be placed carefully. The names will be delivered in person, not through message. I will reach the Marsh rendezvous by the 14th. If I do not, assume compromise. Signed, Lieutenant M. Ardentsev, the final proof." The lieutenant had known, and because he knew, they had silenced him. The discovery spread through the village like wildfire. Reporters returned, headlines flared, and once again the old wound opened. But this time, it was sharper, angrier. The descendants of the Gurin family, still living in nearby towns, denounced the accusations. They claimed the documents were planted, that history was being rewritten by sensationalists. They accused Artyom and Pavel of desecrating property, of spreading propaganda. Threats followed, anonymous phone calls, shadows lingering near windows. Pavel's animals were found dead one morning, poisoned. He said nothing to the police. He simply buried them near the edge of the field, near the place where the lieutenant had lain. Artyom, however, refused to retreat. He scanned and uploaded the documents to multiple servers, sending copies to independent historians abroad. "They can erase people," he told Pavel, "but they can't erase data." Yet he couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him. His apartment in Minsk felt smaller every night. The sound of static followed him wherever he went, on radios, televisions, even in his phone calls. One night, unable to sleep, he opened Natalia's final recording again. He listened to the static at the end, slowing it down, amplifying it. Beneath the white noise, faint but distinct, a voice whispered something in Russian. 3 words. On Vidalich. He saw them. Artyom froze. The lieutenant's last message, perhaps recorded in the final seconds before his death, had been buried in that static. Somehow, Natalia's device had captured it when she stood at the site. The weight of it hit him like a physical blow. The voice, the confirmation, the knowledge, it was all there, locked between history and haunting. When he told Pavel, the older man looked both relieved and terrified. "Then it's done," Pavel said quietly. "The truth's out." But Artyom shook his head. Truth never ends. It just changes who carries it. A week later, Artyom's car was found abandoned near the Berezina River. His laptop and notebooks were missing. No sign of a struggle, no footprints in the mud. Just an open driver's door and a faint impression in the dirt that looked like the outline of a boot print. Soviet military issue, 1940s style. The authorities declared him missing. Online forums lit up with theories. Government interference, revenge by the Gurin descendants, or perhaps something older, stranger. History claiming back what it had lost. Pavel withdrew from public life after that. He rarely left his home. Visitors said he seemed smaller, quieter, as though the weight of everything had pressed him inward. But on clear nights, he would walk to the barn site and sit in silence. He said he no longer feared the wind or the whispers. "They've stopped asking for justice," he once told a neighbor. "They just wanted to be heard." In the summer of 2025, the Ministry of Culture quietly erected a small memorial plaque near the site. It bore no names, just a single inscription in Russian, "To those who vanished between loyalties." The phrase puzzled many, but for those who knew the story, it was perfect. It acknowledged both guilt and innocence, both the betrayed and the betrayers, without distinction. It was the kind of truth history allows. Ambiguous, silent, but undeniable. At dusk, the plaque cast a long shadow over the soil. The wind brushed across it softly, almost tenderly. The villagers said that the air there felt lighter now, as though the ground had finally exhaled after 80 years of holding its breath. But sometimes, when the radio static drifted through the valley, you could still catch the faint pattern of Morse code, 3 short, 3 long, 3 short, followed by 3 more, end. Perhaps that was the lieutenant's final message. Not despair, not warning, just closure. The end of a transmission that had taken 80 years to complete. If you've followed this far into the cold earth of forgotten memory, let the silence between these words remind you that history never truly sleeps. Like the faint hum of a buried signal, it waits for those willing to listen. Subscribe and stay near the static. Because sometimes in the noise, truth still speaks. By late autumn of 2025, the fields around Starye Kleni had fallen silent again. The flowers laid at the memorial plaque had withered into fragile ghosts of color, their petals flattened by the wind. Only the cross that Pavel had built years earlier remained steadfast, its wood darkened by rain, the faint engraving almost erased by time. The air carried the damp smell of rotting leaves, of seasons ending, of stories too heavy to decay. The earth beneath the barn was quiet now, but quiet does not always mean peace. Pavel had aged rapidly in the months since Artyom's disappearance. His hair had gone gray, his shoulders stooped. Each day he moved through the routines of farming like a man wading through fog, guided only by habit. Sometimes he would stand at the edge of his property, watching the horizon where the forests thickened, where the war once raged unseen. He said he could feel the ground humming faintly under his boots, a vibration, too deep for hearing, that seemed to rise from the bones of the land itself. "It's not gone," he murmured once to a passing neighbor. "It's just waiting to be remembered again." In Minsk, Natalia's disappearance and Artyom's presumed death had become subjects of rumor, not investigation. Officially, their names were unconnected, their fates unrelated. But on dark corners of the internet, in forums dedicated to unsolved wartime mysteries, users began linking their stories under a single thread title: "The Last Signal." It became a gathering place for those who believed that history itself could still speak through frequencies, through interference, through the thin veil between the living and the dead. Among their shared files were the recordings Natalia had left behind, her voice distorted, the static like breathing. Some claimed that if you slowed the final minutes, you could hear faint whispers behind her voice, syllables that matched the pattern of Mikhail's name. Yet not all the whispers belonged to the dead. One post appeared one night on the forum from an anonymous user named R417. The message was short, cryptic: "Not over. Transmission continues. Look under the second crossbeam." The post vanished minutes later, deleted by its author. But before it disappeared, someone captured a screenshot and sent it to Pavel. He didn't use the internet much, but curiosity and dread compelled him. Under the second crossbeam, that night, as the fog rolled low over the fields, Pavel carried a lantern to the barn site. The structure itself was long gone, but a few remnants of the original support beams remained half buried in soil. He knelt near what would have been the second beam from the east side, the place where the lieutenant's bones had once rested. The earth there felt colder than the rest, hard as stone. He began to dig. The lantern flickered as the wind shifted. His shovel struck something solid. Wood again, but not a box this time. A crate, sealed with rusted nails. The smell that escaped when he pried it open was the smell of wet metal and forgotten years. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a radio, Soviet field issue, 1943. A communications set identical to those used by signal officers like Mikhail Ardentsev. Its components were corroded but intact. The dials were frozen in place, the frequency gauge set between two unreadable numbers. Pavel lifted it carefully, the weight heavier than it should have been. He carried it into his house, wiped the dust from its face, and set it on the table. For a long moment, he stared at it, half expecting it to remain silent forever. Then, almost without thinking, he connected it to an old battery he used for his generator. The power flickered weakly through the wires, and the radio coughed to life. Static filled the room, a low, wavering hum. Pavel leaned closer, his breath catching. Through the distortion, he heard faint clicks, the unmistakable rhythm of Morse code. He grabbed a notepad, fumbling to write. The message repeated, slow and deliberate. Ardentsev, mission complete. Return. The transmission cut abruptly, replaced by silence so deep it rang in his ears. Pavel sat frozen, staring at the device. He was no longer sure if what he'd heard was real, or if it was the voice of the earth, the memory of the man who had died there, the echo of something too old to die properly. He whispered into the stillness, "You made it back." Word of Pavel's discovery spread again, first through the village, then through historians, journalists, paranormal enthusiasts. Scientists claimed the transmission was a fluke, interference from an underground cable or a nearby ham radio signal bouncing through atmospheric layers. But others swore it was impossible. The radio had no working tubes, no antenna strong enough to capture modern frequencies. It shouldn't have been able to receive anything. Soon, strange events began to ripple through the region. Farmers reported their radios turning on by themselves at night, always tuned to dead channels filled with soft static. Drivers along the Berezina highway claimed their car speakers hissed and clicked as they passed the fields. A few even reported hearing a man's voice speaking Russian, the same phrase repeated again and again. Report complete. Standing by. By December, the phenomenon faded as abruptly as it had begun. The static grew weaker, then vanished altogether. The silence that followed felt absolute, final. It was as if whatever had been trying to speak through the frequencies had finally said everything it needed to say. Pavel stopped working the land after that. He moved into the village, leaving his house and the field to time. When asked why, he simply said, "It's not mine anymore." The earth had taken back what was owed. In the spring of 2026, a research team conducted a final excavation near the site. They found nothing new, no more bones, no more artifacts, only the impression of the old radio in the dirt, as though it had sunk slightly deeper, swallowed once again by the ground. When they tried to lift it, it crumbled to dust. But one of the researchers, a young woman named Lena, swore she heard something as the last fragments fell apart. A faint, rhythmic tapping, like the heartbeat of the soil itself. She pressed her ear close and thought she heard words, soft, broken, but unmistakable. "Thank you." No one else heard it. Months later, the story of Lieutenant Mikhail Ardentsev was officially archived, the case labeled historically resolved. But that label, cold and bureaucratic, could never contain the full weight of what had happened. His escape, his death, his rediscovery, each part had left fingerprints on those who found him. Pavel, Natalia, Artyom, they had each become part of the story, part of the chain of witnesses linking the living to the dead. The barn site remains quiet now. Grass grows tall where the earth was once broken. The plaque still stands, weathered but unyielding. Visitors still come, some to mourn, some to listen. And when the wind moves across the fields just right, it carries a sound too faint to name. Some say it's only the hum of distant machinery, others the sigh of the trees. But those who know the story, who have stood there in the stillness, hear something else. A soft pattern in the air, like Morse code, repeating endlessly, patiently, "I am still here." And maybe that's all that any of us are, echoes waiting for someone to hear us, voices carried through time by memory and chance. The war may be long over, but the ghosts it left behind still whisper through the soil, reminding us that every field, every barn, every silent place hides the weight of forgotten stories. If you've stayed with this tale to its end, if you've walked through its snow and silence, if you've felt the cold breath of history beneath your skin, then keep it alive. Let the static linger, like the signal that crossed 8 decades of silence. Your voice keeps it from fading again. Leave a comment, share where you're listening from, and keep the memory alive. Like, subscribe, and listen carefully, because somewhere out there, beneath the wind and the earth, another story is beginning to call.